Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Jim Rickards, a fund manager at Tangent Capital and author of this, the blockbuster bestseller around the world, Currency Wars, the must-own book to understand what's going on in the global economy today. Jim Rickards, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Nice to be here.
All right, Jim, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke spoke in Japan on Sunday. He essentially acknowledged that the U.S. is engaged in a currency war. Now, you tweeted that, quote, Bernanke's speech is Fed holding a gun to its own head and saying, nobody move or the dollar gets it.
Right.
Elaborate.
Sure thing. This is actually, it's news and it's not news in two different ways. The currency war has been going on since 2009. This was really concocted at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in September of 2009, announced by the President of the United States in January 2010 in the State of the Union address. But until 2 days ago, neither the Fed nor the Treasury had ever admitted it publicly. Now, finally, we had the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, coming out and saying, yes, we are out to lower the exchange value of the dollar. Now, he said all you other countries, Brazil, Korea, Taiwan, China, as the case may be, have got to appreciate your currencies. If you don't, you're going to get inflation. We're going to keep printing. He's saying, my printing press is bigger than your printing press. And we're going to keep printing. And if you want to maintain a peg to the dollar, if you want to prevent your currency from appreciating, you're going to have to print so much of your own money, in effect outsourcing your monetary policy to us, you're going to get inflation. So he's basically threatening these countries. I found the speech did have a very threatening tone, saying you either have to increase the value of your currency, which of course lowers the dollar, or suffer inflation, one or the other. So, but to hear him talk about it publicly in an explicit way is new. And it's also interesting because the chairman of the Federal Reserve never talks about the exchange value of the dollar. That's the job of the Treasury. So this must have had some kind of implicit Treasury approval, which means Geithner's on board. So I think it's very significant in the fact that Bernanke is sort of coming out of the closet and saying, yes, he is a currency warrior and he's out to trash the dollar.
All right, so the Fed prints, but these other countries, particularly in Asia, if they want to maintain their export business, they in turn must print. So the inflation shows up on their shores and bypasses the U.S., right?
Well, that's what's been happening so far. What Bernanke wants, he wants to, in effect, re-import the inflation. He's sending inflation around the world through the exchange rate mechanism. He wants it to come back to the United States. The Federal Reserve wants inflation in the United States. They want negative real rates. They want inflation. They want to lower the value of the debt by inflating it away. They want to force people into spending money. If you think inflation is going to take off, you're going to go out and buy a car, or buy a house, or a refrigerator, or whatever it is. That's what the Fed wants. The problem is the inflation has not been coming back to the United States. We haven't had very much inflation. That's because it's showing up abroad, because these other countries, and Brazil and China are good examples, they're trying to keep their currencies low. So they're printing, they're lowering rates and printing money, absorbing these capital inflows. But Bernanke's saying, we're not going to give up. QE2 doesn't do it. We're now into QE3, or they're just going to keep printing money and buying securities and flooding the world with dollars until these countries let their currencies appreciate. At that point, our imports will be a lot more expensive because our dollar will be less, and the inflation will come back to the United States. That's the goal. He's not there yet. The point of the speech was to basically threaten these other countries, say appreciate or deal with the inflation.
All right, we're here in the UK, and they just announced their inflation numbers. Numbers are coming down. Of course, they exclude food and energy, and this economy in the UK is mimicking a lot of what's going on in the UK and the US. Can you compare the two economies, the Mervyn King at the Bank of England, Ben Bernanke at the Federal Reserve Bank? Do they have autonomy with each other, or is the Bank of England really an apostle, an underling of the the Federal Reserve Bank? And speak a little bit about the UK, if you could.
Well, they're certainly, I think the key thing, Max, is they're like-minded. You don't have to suppose there's some kind of conspiracy or close cooperation. The fact is Mervyn King and Ben Bernanke come out of the same school, the same sort of neo-Keynesian, and also the belief in the effectiveness of monetary policy in terms of money printing and stimulus. All it really does is create inflation. It doesn't get you anywhere at the end of the day. But the fact that they're pursuing the same policy, Mervyn King and the Bank of England were pursuing a more aggressive quantitative easing program than the Fed was, and they were doing it earlier. The Fed's sort of catching up. So they're both doing the same thing. The main difference I see between the U.S. and the Bank of England is that if the U.S. gets into some kind of difficulty, if there's sort of a run on the dollar, loss of confidence, the U.S. has 8,000 tons of gold that they can bring out to back up the dollar if it's really in distress. The UK, of course, has no significant amount of gold relative to the size of their economy. Europe, on the other hand, the European Central Bank and the European monetary system has even more gold than the United States. So Europe and the U.S. are well stocked with gold. The U.K. is not. So I see if there's going to be a currency crisis sooner than later, I expect it to happen in pound sterling, partly because of quantitative easing, not backed up by any gold.
All right, now I mentioned CPI, and here in the UK they call it the RPI, and the numbers exclude energy and food. You responded that, well, there's not much of a conspiracy here, but what about this idea that governments cook their numbers? What we do know is that in the case of CPI or GDP, every administration seems to redefine what those indexes are and redefine what those numbers are. What's your view in terms of these numbers? Are they massaged? Does it matter? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it does matter because it changes expectations and it affects policy. And it is, you know, in theory, price signals are supposed to matter. If you have free markets, because we don't have free markets, what we have is theater conducted by the Fed. But in a free market system, prices are the way that people decide how to invest capital, how to spend capital. You know, one company's got a cheaper price than the other, so you go to Walmart instead of Costco. I mean, that's the importance of price signals. Now, when the government intervenes and the Fed intervenes or central banks intervene generally, they distort all of that, so you get misallocations of capital, poor decisions, or people are so uncertain they just go to the sidelines. I don't think the numbers are cooked in the sense that I don't think any bureaucrats are sitting there actually lying in terms of the output, but I do think that the numbers are cooked in the sense that the inputs can be affected. It's not so much that they lie about the numbers, but they can manufacture the numbers by changing the inputs. A good example is China. China can make its GDP whatever they want through investment. They have it's government directed. The banks finance it. The banks are controlled by the government, and if they want to increase GDP, they can just go out and build a train station, build a high-speed railroad, build a highway. Even if you don't need it, even if it's wasted capacity, they can just go ahead and do it. In the U.S., of course, we've got monetary manipulation, efforts to cheapen the dollar, print money. So there's all kinds of manipulation going on. There are certainly, I think it's interesting that, you know, we have an election coming up in a few weeks in the United States, and the economy of Ohio is doing significantly better than the economy of the rest of the United States. Well, it's no surprise. Ohio is one of the major swing states. Probably the candidate that wins Ohio will win the presidency. So why are we surprised that there's so much money being poured into Ohio? So again, it's not so much that they lie about it, but they manipulate it by basically changing the inputs. When you change the inputs, you're going to change the outputs. All
right, Jim, you're a money manager. You've been in the business for decades. You've got a foot both in Washington, in the intelligence community to some degree, as well as being a very sophisticated hedge fund manager. The price signals being generated, you're playing a meta game. You know, you're looking at it in terms of the game within the game. But the businesses out there, the businessmen, the mom and poppers, the farmers, they don't have that level of sophistication. And these price signals are failing to communicate to them what they might be doing in this environment. As a result, they're full of fear. They're not making the investments, or they're hoarding cash, or they're just sitting on the sidelines, or they're just confused and angry. What about this disconnect? Because you see it more and more in American and in the global society, where you've got a group of folks who can decipher the meta signal, the real signal, and everybody else who seems to, you know, be just confused and bewildered. Is this a growing problem? Is there any way to rectify this problem, or is this an exaggeration?
No, I think it's a very important point, Max. Actually, I think it's the most important problem in the U.S. economy. Go back to the Great Depression in the 1930s. What's always intrigued me is it's not so much what caused it, but why did it last so long? Why did it last for 10 years compared to, say, the Depression of 1920, which lasted 18 months? And the best analysis I've ever seen is one that said it was what economists call regime uncertainty. You know, policy in the Hoover and the Roosevelt administrations changed so often. There was government interventions. They put on price supports. They take them away. You know, devalue, confiscate gold. Try to pack the Supreme Court. And businesses just went to the sidelines and said, I'm going to wait till this is over. The same thing is going on today. And, you know, the day after Bernanke's Tokyo speech, we talked about that at the beginning of the interview, William Dudley, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and a permanent member of the Federal Open Market Committee, gave a speech that talked about this. And he said, you know, we've underestimated the duration of this. You know, we're not technically in a recession, but growth is so slow. My analysis is we're in a depression. So Dudley's answer is just print more money, more ease, more aggressive easing, and he says that. He said, with hindsight, I wish we had eased even more than we did. That is not the problem. The problem is the one we just talked about, which is this regime uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen to the Bush tax cuts. We don't know what's going to happen to the payroll tax. You know, Mitt Romney says he'll repeal Obamacare. Obama says he'll keep it. So you don't know what's going to happen to your health care costs. So if you're a business person, you're not going to commit any capital right now because you don't know, you can't calculate your return. So I do think this is the biggest cause of a lack of robust growth in the U.S. economy. Until we get some policy certainty on taxes, healthcare costs, monetary policy, we're not going to see growth. We are Japan. We're just going to have potentially decades of low and subpar growth.
All right, finally, you mentioned the Depression, and now there seems to be a focused attention on how the Depression started, how people got out of it, how we got out of it in the United States. There's three scenarios in terms of getting out of it that I would identify. One would be the Keynesian spending from the government, the deficit spending, the work relief programs. Number two would be bank reform. Remember, the entire industry was reformed, and you had the Securities Act of 33 and 34 eventually, and it set the stage for a more robust Wall Street. And of course, you had the devaluation of the dollar against gold, which sounds like something that would, out of your book, your currency war, you know, you talk about it at great length. Of those three scenarios, which one really contributed to America getting out of the Depression? Bank reform, dollar collapsed, or deficit spending?
Well, I would say bank reform was a positive step, but it really wasn't a macroeconomic move. It was a regulatory move. So separating commercial banking and investment banking was a positive step. It's something we should do today, by the way. We should undo the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which happened in 1999 during the Clinton administration. So that's a good thing, but by itself, it's not enough. As far as devaluing from gold, the problem with the 1920s and the 1930s is that gold actually was undervalued. It should have had a much higher value, so that was probably just an adjustment. But you didn't have to confiscate the people's gold, which is what Roosevelt did. You could have had a more honest upward revaluation of the price of gold just to get to it. It was a non-equilibrium price, a little different from where we are today. The Keynesian policy did no good at all. It was tried over and over. That's not what got us out of the Great Depression. The best theory I've seen is that actually, if you take out war spending, obviously the economy and industrial production picked up in 1941 and 1942. Well, we were fighting World War II and spending enormous amounts of money, deficit spending to do that, increasing the debt. But that was existential. You had to do that. But the economy didn't really get onto a permanent growth footing until 1946, after the war, when the Republicans took over Congress and lowered taxes. That's what did the trick. So if you factor out the war spending, we were not out of the Great Depression as late as 1946, and it was those tax cuts in 46 that really set us off on an excellent growth path throughout the 1950s and on into the 1960s.
Jim Rickards, we're out of time. Dang it! But anyway, we'll have to have you on again soon. Thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Jim Rickards, authored of the seminal and must-own book, Currency Wars. Until next time, Max Kaiser saying, oh yeah, and don't forget to send me an email at kaiserreport@rttv.ru. Bye, y'all.